On with the show.
Hey everybody, hope you guys enjoyed your intermission. Let's get right back to it. Please put your hands together for our next speaker, Mr. Michael Shellenberger.
Around the world, people look to California for leadership when it comes to clean energy and climate change. In 2006, we were one of the first states to pass aggressive climate change legislation, and our emissions have come down ever since. Last year, we passed legislation that requires that by 2030, we get half of our power from renewables. And our per capita energy consumption is some of the lowest in the United States. Now, I've been in California for 20 years, all of that time as an environmental activist, and 10 years of that as an energy analyst. And so I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that I never actually questioned any aspect of that story I just told you. All the facts I mentioned are correct, they just end up painting a really misleading story. So what do I mean? Well, we do get a lot of power from solar. Last year we got 10% of our electricity from solar, but it was actually more solar energy than we could use. This spring, we actually had to cut off the power from our solar farms so it wouldn't overwhelm the grid. And we've been adding more and more clean energy in aggregate terms, but you can see that since 1990, the percentage of power from clean energy sources has actually declined from 51% to 46%. What about emissions? Well, emissions did decline, as I mentioned, since 2000, but the interesting thing is they actually declined less than the national average. And I mentioned before the climate legislation in 2006. Well, here's the funniest part. Our emissions actually declined 4 times faster before we passed that climate legislation. Well, what about energy consumption? Well, the truth is that our low per capita energy consumption is a result of a couple of main factors. The first is just that our energy prices are much higher than the rest of the country, so our energy-intensive industries had to relocate elsewhere, things like manufacturing and factories. And then the other reason is that we live in a really temperate climate, and so we just don't need as much heating and air conditioning for our buildings and homes as other parts of the country. In other words, in California, we're not actually leading the clean energy revolution, we're losing it. Well, why is that? Well, to understand the reason, we have to go back in time exactly 50 years to a very special moment in American and I think in human history, and that's the rise of nuclear fear. Now, most people don't realize that in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of environmentalists were actually pro-nuclear. I mean, the Sierra Club argued for nuclear power plants as a way to not have to build hydroelectric dams, which require covering up a lot of the landscape, doing a lot of damage over a lot of areas. In 1966, there ended up being a really big debate inside the Sierra Club, which a very powerful organization back then, really the main environmental organization in the state. And the debate was over whether or not to build a nuclear power plant just a half an hour away from here, Diablo Canyon. The most eloquent advocate for building Diablo Canyon was this man, Will Seary. He was a biophysicist at the University of California, Berkeley, and a member of the Sierra Club Board of Directors. He was also a pretty amazing mountaineer. Here he was in the Himalayas. He and his buddies almost starved to death in the Himalayas. Back then, you had to be a pretty badass mountaineer to be on the board of the Sierra Club. But Seary didn't just like nuclear power. Seary loved it. He wrote, "Nuclear power is one of the chief long-term hopes for conservation." What did he mean by that? Well, cheap, affordable, and abundant power, he argued, was essential to allow people to move to the cities, to get jobs in the cities. And that would allow the countryside to return to grasslands and forests for endangered species to come back. And if you're going to have all those people in the city and you're going to have all that power, it had to be clean. And if you didn't want to do hydroelectric dams anymore, you really just left with one main alternative, and that was nuclear. Now, Seary had some very fierce opponents inside the Sierra Club. Maybe the most important one was this man, David Brower. He was the executive director of the Sierra Club, and he made the opposite argument to Seary. If a doubling of the state's population in the next 20 years is encouraged by providing the power resources for this growth, California's scenic character will be destroyed, he argued. In other words, The problem it's not about cities and countryside, it was just too many people coming to California. Well, a few years later, one of the Sierra Club's top advisors even went so far as to say, look, even if it's clean power, it doesn't matter. This is Amory Lovins, and he said, it'd be little short of disastrous for us to discover a source of clean, cheap, abundant energy because of what we would do with it. Now, you might be wondering what happened. Well, obviously, you know that Diablo Canyon exists, but here's maybe the most surprising thing. In 1966, 1967, and then again in 1969, the Sierra Club Board of Directors and their membership voted in favor of Diablo Canyon, and support during that time actually grew. In the final vote, it was 3-1 in favor of building Diablo Canyon. Well, after this loss, David Brower left the Sierra Club in 1969. He founded a new organization called Friends of the Earth. He knew that he had to do something different than what they had done before to stop nuclear power. And he remembered back to 1962, when a young activist named David Pessinen came to him, and they worked out going to see a different nuclear power plant that was being proposed in Northern California. Here is David Pessinen and his friend Hazel Mitchell. David Pessinen came back to the Sierra Club Board of Directors, and he said, look, I think I can stop this plant, but we're not going to just do it with the conventional conservation arguments and tools. We're going to have to make a really different argument. We're going to have to argue that nuclear power plants are similar to nuclear weapons. And the Sierra Club Board of Directors was pretty upset by this. I mean, almost everybody on it was like not willing to go there. I mean, they all knew that nuclear power plant meltdowns could potentially be very bad, but they were not like nuclear bombs going off. Pessinen, though, was undeterred, and he actually ended up leaving the Sierra Club. And very shortly after, he and Hazel Mitchell produced a report that said that if this nuclear power plant went forward, it would create death dust, a kind of fallout that would poison the milk. And they organized local dairies, and in the process of doing that, they discovered an extraordinarily powerful invisible force, and that's the fear of mothers that their children might be poisoned. This finally affected the Sierra Club as a whole. By 1974, the head of the Sierra Club was saying, our campaign stressing the hazards of nuclear power will supply a rationale for increasing regulation and add to the cost of the industry. This is from an internal strategy document. In 5 years, David Brower's fear-based strategy had done outside the Sierra Club what he had failed to do inside of it, and that was to make the organization and really the rest of the environmental movement anti-nuclear. Now, the Sierra Club at the time found a strong ally in the young new governor of California, Jerry Brown. And between 1975 and 1978, they would kill 2 major nuclear power plants with multiple reactors on them. David Pessinen had a ballot initiative that was in the works, and Jerry Brown used that to pass the legislation that effectively outlawed nuclear power, with the exception of nuclear power plants already under construction, including Diablo Canyon. Here's later, when one of the historians came back and was asking questions about what went on with anti-nuclear activists, he interviewed this man, Martin Litton, who was one of the first ones to photograph Diablo Canyon from the sky. And he asked Martin, he said, how worried were you actually about meltdowns? Martin said, I really didn't care about possible nuclear accidents because there are too many people anyway. I think that playing dirty if you have a noble end is fine.